It's April 25th, 1976. The Dodgers and the Cubs are playing in Dodger Stadium on a seemingly normal day of baseball. Wouldn't be like that for long, though. First 3 innings, they go by fine, but before the 4th inning, 2 men are seen running onto the field with an American flag, matches, and lighter fluid. They are going to burn the American flag on the field during a baseball game. I'll tell you more about that later. Baseball is boring. The average amount of time for a game is 3 hours, and in that time span, stuff usually doesn't happen. In baseball, you have about a 25% chance of getting a hit, and let's say that there's 30 seconds in between each pitch, which is fair, and 3.8 pitches per at-bat, which is the average. Then you're looking at about 7 minutes and 30 seconds between each hit, which is like the only interesting thing that happens in baseball. And when you compare that to sports like basketball, which are gaining popularity, then you start to see why baseball is starting to die. In its heyday, baseball was America's primary sport for about a good century before being overtaken by football in the 60s. With this in mind, I don't think there is anything that has represented America better culturally since like the end of the 19th century than baseball. Baseball's a lot like a tree. If you cut it down and you examine its history, then what you'll often see is that its environment has affected it over the years, whether it's good or it's bad. And today we're going to look to see how baseball has done this over the years.
We have an incredible show for you tonight. I'm not going to have this job for long. It's Exile. It's me. It's you. These are our guests. Let's go. Yeah. I gave up and became a Spotify, paying myself a fraction of a penny playing qualifiers. I'm looking up and I'm stuck in a Chucky movie, saying yucky to chuckles like it's Lucky Louie. So somebody better cancel me before I get a chance to screen this naked dance routine. It's dark comedy, cold as a soldier stare. I've been exposed, so now the lows is my overwear. And I'm a polar bear with words for a fancy song. I think it's the first verse from Little Miss Can't Be Wrong. I like to spin doctors. Is that dude's Finn's father or just an imposter? The new internet things to be pretend awkward, non-prescription, thick rim frames of rented gym lockers. I'm a rapper, we lament being broke. All the comics get money, but they spend it on coke. You can watch us on the news feeds. Y'all's mornings up until America admits that it likes dogs more than us.
To compare the founding of baseball to the founding of America, I took some key cultural points that shaped America from most of the APUSH periods, and throughout this we're going to compare it to similar moments in baseball's development, and hopefully I can show you how closely the two are related. Cool? Cool. Okay, the first ever baseball team was the New York Knickerbocker Baseball Club, which was founded in September of 1845. The person who ended up writing the rules for this team was firefighter Alexander Joy Cartwright, which makes him the founder of baseball, depending on who you ask. The game would continue to grow over the years until in 1875, where in Cincinnati, the MLB would be created with 8 original charter teams, all of which eventually disbanded, except for one, the Boston Red Sox, who eventually became the Atlanta Braves. When it was founded, America was seen as an opportunity to escape religious persecution. Baseball came into fruition during the Gilded Age in America, and in this period, the government didn't really have any intervention in the economy, and it led to a lot of corruption through monopolies and political houses, which cut into the quality of life for a lot of lower and middle class citizens. And for these citizens, baseball quickly became an outlet to escape a lot of these realities of life, which it might not be quite as harsh as religious persecution, but you can see how it comes from the same place. Also, since its foundation, baseball has always been predominantly white, and for a while, baseball teams were essentially whites-only country clubs. On top of that, in this period of America, we had just united from the Civil War, so there was a lot of racial tensions, especially in the South. And although disclusion from baseball was never a written rule like it was in the Constitution, it was certainly unwritten, which in many cases might even be stronger than a written rule. By the time the 1900s came around, the MLB was a dominant cultural force. Players like Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, and Lou Gehrig dominated baseball and became well-known celebrities. However, In 1919, baseball would forever be tarnished when the Chicago White Sox threw the World Series against the Cincinnati Reds, where they were heavily favored and lost on purpose for money. This would later be called the Black Sox scandal. Corruption in the early 1900s through fixing baseball games is well known, as scandals like the Black Sox scandal have shaken the sports world. However, what made itself known at that time was that some teams began to prioritize the money over the actual enjoyability of the game. Compare this to the Gilded Age and the greed and corruption that happened there, as well as the prioritization of big business over a lot of the needs of the people. And you can see that baseball did replicate a lot of those tendencies during this time. After the Black Sox scandal, as a result to the shunning of African Americans from the MLB, the Negro Leagues were founded. This league showcased great talent, from Satchel Paige to, in my opinion, the best player to never play in the MLB, John Gibson, who in his 17-year career was believed to hit between 800 and 1,000 home runs, which is more than any player in MLB history. The Negro Leagues showed that talent was not the reason why there were any African Americans in the MLB, and it also shined a spotlight on a lot of very talented African American baseball players who would eventually get their shot in the MLB. However, for those guys to get their chance, someone would have to break baseball's color barrier. There's a reason why Jackie Robinson's number is retired by every team in the MLB. What he did for baseball is incredibly important for its history. When Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers decided to break the unwritten rule and bring Jackie Robinson into the MLB, there was tons of backlash from fans across the country. Jackie Robinson saw a lot of death threats, racism, and danger in his first few years, and his resilience to this and his ability to just focus on baseball helped him pave the way for African Americans in MLB. Branch Rickey and eventually the rest of his teammates began to back up Jackie Robinson, and together they paved the path for African Americans in the MLB. In the next few years, the Dodgers would go on to sign a few more players from the Negro League, such as catcher Roy Campanella, Sammy Amoros, and Jim Gillian. And 8 years after Jackie Robinson came into the league, Jackie Robinson and his Brooklyn Dodgers won the World Series, thanks to large contributions from many Negro League players. While through most of history, baseball reflected American culture, I think this was a moment in history where American culture reflected after baseball. Because the years after Jackie Robinson's career were sort of the peak years of the civil rights movement, and it led to the equality of African Americans in society. And I feel like the actions of Jackie Robinson and how things transpired in baseball directly influenced it in a major way. When Jackie Robinson came into baseball, he essentially started baseball civil war. The racial tensions that existed before, they were amplified, and players basically had to take a stance on a very dividing issue. Furthermore, the moral stance against segregation taken by people like Branch Rickey is very similar to the stance taken by the Union during the Civil War. Sort of this sense of moral righteousness to abolish the thing that they are against. Jackie Robinson and the Dodgers successfully integrated baseball, much like the Union had successfully integrated African Americans into society with the Emancipation Proclamation. However, a lot like this Emancipation Proclamation, there was a lot of political equality, but there wasn't enough social equality, as there were still racial tensions and racism that existed. And these are things that continue to exist in both instances even through today, as racism is still a major problem in a lot of areas in America. A year after the Dodgers won the World Series, a 19-year-old center fielder was entering the MLB. Curt Flood was a very good center fielder. He was a 3-time All-Star and 7-time Gold Glove in his 14-year career, and he helped the St. Louis Cardinals to 2 World Series victories. His career was very respectable. However, that's not really what he's known for. It's 1969, and the Cardinals just traded Curt Flood to the Phillies. Flood had been a Cardinal for the past 12 years, so he's pretty ticked off about this. At this time, players in baseball didn't really get to choose where they played, like they can now, and the only way they could really change teams is if they were cut or traded. This policy in baseball was referred to as the reserve clause, and it existed in a lot of different sports in their own way. Curt Flood really did not want to go to Philadelphia, and he wrote a letter to the MLB discussing his frustration. After 12 years in the major leagues, I do not feel like I am a piece of property to be bought and sold irrespective to my wishes. He did wish to play the 1970 season, just not with Philadelphia, and he believed that he had a right to consider offers from other clubs before making any decision. A lot of people supported him, including Jackie Robinson. However, the majority of people, including most fans, supported not supporting him. Curt Flood was a wealthy baseball player, and everyday people who worked 9 to 5 didn't want to hear their entertainment complain about not having rights. However, at this time in America, the civil rights movement had been successful, and Curt Flood was obviously influenced by this, by challenging the reserve clause. He even said that the reserve clause was the modern-day equivalent of slavery. Anyways, Bowie Kuhn, the commissioner of the MLB, declined his request, so he decided to sue baseball. He argued that the reserve clause violated antitrust laws as well as the 13th Amendment. The case became a pretty big deal and ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court. Flood's court case was diminished by the fact that he couldn't get any current players to testify with him, since it would basically be career suicide. So when the case was brought to court, Flood, with no players to testify with, was at a huge disadvantage, and the court ruled in favor of Kuhn 5-3. I think the actions of Curt Flood can accurately reflect the cultural movements of the early and mid-1900s. He resembled a pattern in this period where minorities like women, homosexuals, and African Americans were protesting and getting increasing rights, and the general public as well was also transitioning, becoming more modern and accepting of these groups. This is also seen in how Curt Flood influenced those around him, because in the wake of these flood trials, basketball and hockey both demolished their equivalent to the reserve clause. And the social movements, specifically of the earlier 1900s, reflect this also, as they heavily influenced the later protests that occurred in the 60s, such as the Civil Rights Movement. And all of this really puts the Flood versus Kuhn court case into perspective, because the mass majority of people were against Flood at this time, which made it both an effect of this time and a major outlier. Like those movements, though, it ushered in a modern era for baseball, making a changing point in players' rights, which much closely reflects the baseball that we see today. So now it's the 80s. Drugs have officially become an epidemic in America, and some hard drugs like cocaine are starting to ravage inner cities, thanks in large part to the war on drugs, which begins in this time as well under the Reagan administration. MLB players are not excluded from this, and many players find themselves hooked on hard drugs. Players like Lonnie Smith, Joaquin Andujar, and Keith Hernandez all admitted to using those drugs, citing that it made them feel strong. Now, hold on, I'm not one to advocate for drug use, and I'm definitely not saying that you should go out and do steroids, but in baseball, I'll say it, steroids were awesome. Everyone was hitting the ball further and harder than ever before. Infamous juicers like Jose Canseco and Mark McGwire came into the league in the 80s and immediately began clobbering. In fact, Mark McGwire broke the all-time rookie home run record, and Jose Canseco won the MVP in just his third year. These guys paved the way, and by the time the 90s came around, steroid use became a lot more popular. Perhaps the most famous steroid user ever, Barry Bonds, he won 3 MVPs in this decade, and other players like Roger Clemens and Slammin' Sammy Sosa began to indulge in some gym candy as well. Mark McGwire even broke the record for most home runs in a single season by hitting 70. So by the time the early 2000s came along, players like Barry Bonds were juiced into a new dimension. He had 4 of the best seasons in baseball history, adding 4 more MVPs to his repertoire and a 73 home run season, just 3 years after McGwire broke the record. Other notable juicers include infamous crybaby Alex Rodriguez and Miguel Tejada, both of which won the MVP juice. Okay, now it's 2005, and baseball is about to get boring. You see, most of the people who did steroids didn't actually admit that they used them. Instead, Jose Canseco did. In 2005, Jose Canseco released a book called Juiced, which discussed steroid use in the MLB from the biggest steroid abusers ever. He claimed that most players in the era used steroids, and that when used in small doses and monitored by physicians, steroid use can be a beneficial thing for players and help improve career longevity. It was a very interesting book and provided great insight to the possible benefits of properly utilizing this drug. And if America wasn't still waging war against drugs, then the reaction from the baseball world might have been a little different. George W. Bush had to get involved, and in his State of the Union address, he said, "The use of performance-enhancing drugs like steroids in baseball is dangerous, and it sends the wrong message, that there are shortcuts to accomplishment and that performance is more important than character." Bush also advocated for the punishment of players caught with PEDs, which led to players who were caught on PEDs getting a suspension later on. If you take a step back and look at the policies of Bush, as well as all the presidents that preceded him up until Reagan, you see a very traditional suspension-based method for dealing with drug use, as opposed to something that has its roots in treatment or just legalizing it altogether. This approach taken, as well as its objective ineffectiveness, actively reflects the issues from the war on drugs, which can still be felt today in America. The steroids era does not only reflect the inner-city crackdown on drugs, but also the demographics and racism that coincided with it. If you look at baseball's demographics, the year they started issuing suspensions, which is 2005, you'll see that 36% of all MLB players were black or Hispanic. Now, if you look at the demographics of the people given suspensions for PED use, you'll find that those two demographics make up 77% of the total suspensions, which is similarly disproportionate to the war on drugs, whether it's intentional or not. Well, now it's 2018, and baseball is dying. Its ratings are on the decline, the average age of fans is increasing, and it seems like no matter what the league tries, it can't get more people to watch baseball games. So far this year, baseball attendance is at almost record lows. If we compare 2017 to 2018, there are only 3 teams with an average attendance of 40,000 people, 11 teams in the 30,000s, 14 teams in the 20,000s, and only 2 teams in the 10,000s. This year, there are still 3 teams in the 40,000s, but now there are only 8 teams in the 30,000s and 9 teams in the 20,000s, and an astonishing 10 teams in the 10,000s. I think that makes sense though. As we have gone over, baseball represents a lot of the ideologies of the 18 and 1900s. It's slowly dying hopefully means that concepts prevalent in these times like racism and exploitation will die alongside it. Much like these ideas, however, I don't think baseball is ever going to die. There will always be people who are willing to watch a baseball game, even though it's never going to be the cultural phenomenon that it was in the past. That's okay. Baseball had its time, but it's a new era. In this way especially, I think baseball represents America. As we enter a new age, we can look back at these moments from our past with a sense of pride or with shame. It's still the 4th inning. They are still about to set the American flag on fire. The first match is lit, blown out by the wind. The second match is lit, and just before all hope was lost, Rick Monday swoops in and takes the flag. Just when you thought all hope was lost, baseball finds a way. Baseball is the American flag. You can try to light it on fire, you can try to kill it, but as long as there is America, there will be baseball. And that is not that boring.